All right guys, let's talk about carburetor tuning, carburetor setup. And this course has focused on the Briggs LO206 motor. And this is a box stock class, so there's really not much that we can change on this carburetor in order to affect the way that it runs. I mean, we've got fixed jets, both high speed and low speed. You cannot change those. You have to run what the carburetor comes with. You don't want to mess with them. Those are definitely a tech item. Everyone has to run the same thing, so that kind of evens the playing field a little bit. So in my opinion, there's really only two changes that we can make to this thing. There's actually a third change over here on the side of the carburetor. We actually have a low speed air screw. And you can actually back this in or back it out in order to increase or decrease the amount of air that this thing gets basically while it's at idle. I never mess with it. I've got mine set to 1 1/4 turns out. That's how I've always ran it, so I just go ahead and leave that there. And to do that, what you'll do is you'll just turn it all the way in, and you don't want to crank it in. There's actually a spring around it, just like this screw here. So you don't want to crank it down too hard, but just as soon as the screw stops, and then go ahead and back that out 1 1/4 turns, and you should be good to go. So outside of that, the only changes we can really make are going to be we can change the float height. And this is going to affect the amount of fuel that your motor gets on the top end. So when you're full throttle, banging the rev limiter, this is what's going to adjust the amount of fuel that it gets on the top end. And there's actually a needle here in our slide, and we can adjust the height of this needle in order to affect the amount of fuel that our motor gets on the bottom end. Kind of the rule of thumb is these motors like to be rich on the bottom, lean on the top. So that's how I've tried to get mine set up. The Briggs recommended settings for your float height, I believe, are 0.860 of an inch. That's their recommended float height, and most guys probably just run these things. They just pull them out of the box, slap them on their motor, and they're good to go. And most likely that's gonna work for you. What we're really doing here is we're really just splitting hairs, trying to make these little fine adjustments. So our track here, we're running at 4,300 feet. And the way I understand carburetor tuning and fuel consumption is that the higher elevation you're at, the worse air you have, so the less fuel you're gonna wanna feed into your motor. And on the other side, if you're running at a lower level, say for instance sea level, the better air you have, the more fuel you can give your motor. So with that thought process in mind, what I've done is I've actually increased my float height in order to limit the amount of fuel that gets into my bowl so that my top end's a little bit leaner. And in order to do that, there's a little tab here on your floats. And what you can do is if you bend that tab down, that's gonna actually increase your float height. And if you bend that tab up, that's gonna lower your float height. So it's kind of opposite. If you increase your float height, you limit the amount of fuel that gets into your bowl. And if you lower your float height, that it actually increases the amount of fuel that gets in your bowl. So I mean, if you're looking at it like this, and we raise our float height, and we've got the bowl on top, you'll notice that these sit up higher. So as soon as more fuel gets in there, it's going to close your main jet off quicker if your floats are higher. And on the other side, if your floats are down low, like deep in here like this, your bowl is going to be able to fill up more before it's going to actually push that needle closed and close off your main jet. So how you change this is you'll actually want to get like a little miniature screwdriver, just like this one. And to increase it, what you would do is you would actually flip your floats over. And what I found the easiest way to do it is actually you get underneath the tab here with your screwdriver and just bend that tab down. And we're talking just barely, just little changes here. You're not going to want to just tank on this thing, or you're going to bend this thing a lot farther than you need to. And on the other side, if you wanted to lower it, what I would do is I would flip my float over like this and then bend that tab up by getting underneath it and bending that up. So that's how you're going to adjust your float height, and that'll affect the amount of fuel that you'll get on the top end of your motor. So if you wanted to affect the lower end, the bottom end of your motor, what we have is we've got a clip inside of our slide. And let me pull this out for you so you can actually see it. And when you do that, just make sure you don't lose your retaining clip. And it might be kind of hard to see, but if you're looking at this clip, we've actually got 5 slots there that we can actually adjust that clip. So if we moved this clip up on our needle here, what that's going to do is that's going to cause the needle to sit deeper into your carburetor, actually restricting the amount of fuel that gets through the main jet on the bottom end while your throttle's closed. And on the other side, if we moved our clip down, that's going to lift the needle up, allowing more fuel to get past the needle on the bottom end through the main jet. And it's really just as simple as that. Something you're going to need to test. What I do is I just run mine in the middle. I've moved this up and down. I find that this is the best position for us. Something you'll need to try at your track. I bet you this middle needle position is probably the most common you'll see. I forget where your motors come, but I would imagine that's probably where the needle comes when you buy your carburetor. So that's how you'll change the amount of fuel that you get on the bottom end. So let's actually put this float on so I can show you how you can measure your float height. And to do that, we'll grab our float, we'll slide our needle over the float, and we'll drop it into the hole here. Put our arm in, just like so. Okay, just like that. Okay, so in order to measure your float height, you're going to need to get yourself some digital calipers. And what these have is they've got actually this little measuring stick that'll actually protrude out the bottom of your caliper here. So you can set your distance based off that. And if you remember, I said I run my float a little higher than the recommended Briggs setting. So the setting I've chose is actually 0.886 of an inch. Just like so, if you can read that there. And in order to measure that, what you'll do is you'll just hold this caliper over your carburetor and rest that little stick on the edge of your carburetor, and you want it to be just on the top of your float before it starts pushing it down. And that right there is our float height. And you'll want to make sure it's the same on both sides. Just like that. And like I said, we're splitting hairs here. Doesn't have to be perfect, but as you can clearly see, my float height is definitely a little higher than the recommended settings, essentially limiting some of the fuel that gets into the bowl and limiting the fuel on the top end. And if you're in a situation where one of your floats is higher than the other, what you can do is, let me pop this back out here. What you can do is just real gently twist this thing, kind of like you would to pop ice out of a tray. You'd want to just slightly twist it, so whatever side's lower, you know, kind of twist that side up just ever so slightly. You'll find if you tweak on these things even just a little bit, it'll greatly change the height of the float. So you're going to want to be real careful when you make that adjustment. And it's as simple as that. You can adjust the float drop. You'll hear people talk about float drop. In all the years I've been running this is actually our second motor, and I didn't adjust the float drop on either one of my carburetors. And what you'll see is there's a little tab here, and you can actually bend that back and forth. And what that does is when your float is sitting in your bowl, it'll drop down and it'll rest up against the post here, and you can actually adjust it. It doesn't affect the tuning, but if, for example, if this thing's too loose and it's bouncing up and down too much, it could potentially fall out of your carburetor while you're running, and that would definitely not be good. So let's take a look at one other slight adjustment I make. These carburetors have an idle speed screw, and I've actually got it pulled out here. And this idle speed screw will go right in this hole right here. And what that does is once you have that screwed in, it'll actually protrude into the opening of your carburetor, and you can actually adjust it. In the further in you go, it'll actually hold your slide up higher inside of the carburetor, and you can adjust your idle speed that way. So what you would do is you would pull your throttle so your slide is up in the carburetor, turn it in a little bit, let go of the throttle, and it's actually going to adjust how high that sits in, and you can make fine adjustments to your idle speed that way. I've chosen to not change my idle that way. What I do is on our chassis, we've actually got this little adjustment bolt here, and this screws into our chassis, and we run our throttle cable through it. And I'll actually just install it with this all the way in. And then if for some reason I need to increase my idle speed, what I'll do is I'll just turn this screw. And what that's doing is it's actually increasing the amount of pull that it's pulling on that throttle cable, and that'll actually pull my slide up in the carburetor, and I can adjust my idle speed that way. So that's how I choose to adjust my idle speed. So what I do with this screw, and if you're looking down here, you can see through there. What I like to do is I like to get a little teeny bit of Loctite. And what I'll do is I'll just put a little dab, just a littlest bit of dab of Loctite here on this screw. Just like so, just the teeniest little bit. We'll put our spring back on. And then what I do is I'll put my idle speed screw in here, start it by hand. And then what I'll do is I'll actually turn this in just enough to hold this into the housing so that it doesn't fall out on me. And I'll turn this in so you actually can see it protrude into the opening of the carburetor, and then we'll actually back it out. Hopefully you can see it. Let's get this turned in here. That might be real tough to see. But yeah, you can actually see it. So there on this side of the carburetor, as you're looking down in there, you can see that screw protruding, I guess essentially restricting air that's getting through your motor. So what I've heard and the advice I've taken is you go ahead and back this screw out so that it's just out of the way, just like that. And with the little bit of Loctite, since that's screwed in just ever so slightly, that's going to keep it from falling out. And I just go ahead and leave it there and forget about it. I do not adjust that screw ever unless I'm running this thing through an ultrasonic cleaner or something. And then I'll go ahead and I'll adjust my idle speed with this screw that's on my chassis. Thought process is it's just going to allow more air to get through there. The more air we can get in there, the better our carburetor and our motor is going to run. So that's how I've actually chosen to run that screw. I ran for years and I used that screw as my idle adjustment. We won plenty of races when I was adjusting it like that. I've chosen to go the other route just because, like I said, we're splitting hairs here. So last thing that I'll want to show you is actually how to install this onto your intake manifold. This is another thing that I feel is pretty crucial to the way that this thing's going to operate for you. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and put this carburetor back together real quick, change the camera angle so you can see how I install this on the manifold. Okay, so when we're putting this carburetor back on, here's our intake manifold. You'll notice that we've got a single hole here, and then we've actually got this bigger hole here, which actually allows us to rock our carburetor back and forth. And what I like to do when I put this on is I like to ensure that this bottom edge of my intake manifold lines up real nice and good with the bottom edge of our carburetor here, just to ensure that there's not a big lip, because sometimes when you put this on there and you look down the middle, you'll notice that you can see a substantial portion of this, which is making air have to come in and then go up over that lip and over to get into your motor. So what I'll do is I'll get this put on here, and then I'll show you how I actually make that adjustment. Grab our carburetor screws. That side in. And like I said, what we can do is we can actually rock this back and forth. So what I like to do is I like to cinch these up so they're pretty snug with just a little bit of room, so I can actually move this around without it just falling all over the place. So I'll tighten these up just a little bit here. See if I can still move this around. Yeah. So you want to snug that up just where we're able to move it around. And then what we'll do is we'll look down in there. And if you can see that, hopefully you can see that. As we're looking down in there, when I adjust this, you can see the intake manifold's lip down there at the bottom. So what I'll do is I'll just rock this up until that inside of the intake manifold and the edge of the carburetor line up with each other, just like that. It's probably going to be real hard for you to see, but as you're looking down in here, you can definitely see the edge of the intake manifold with the flashlight. When you're shining it down there, just make sure those two line up, and then we'll go and try to button down our carburetor without moving things. And again, these bolts, you'll want them tight, but not too tight. Still good. You definitely don't want your carburetor falling off while you're on the track. And just snug up both sides. Just like that. Shine our flashlight down in there, and it looks like we're still good. So that's how I put my carburetor on. Just make sure that the bottom edges of both the carburetor and your intake manifold line up, and you should be good to go. Like I said a couple times throughout the video, we're splitting hairs here. Definitely something that you can play with. You're not going to need to adjust things too far away from the default settings, but definitely feel free to adjust those depending on what altitude you're running at. If you're running at a high altitude, maybe try leaning the top end out a little bit, and if you're running at a lower altitude, maybe go ahead and enrichen that top end up a bit. But something you're definitely going to want to go out and try. Make these settings part of your maintenance plan and part of your race plan, and have a good time at track.